The church hall was too clean. The air smelled like flowers that had tried too hard to live. Rows of white lilies stood along the aisle, their heavy perfume mixing with candle smoke that rose and vanished in slow curls. The floor shone dark as syrup, showing the ceiling lights as watery ghosts. Programs waited on every chair, folded and patient. The title printed on their fronts said in black letters that Grace Thompson was gone. But the ink could not make Rachel believe it. Rachel sat small and straight on her chair, the hem of her black dress brushing her knees. The fabric scratched her legs. Her shoes were tight, not her own. Aunt Margaret had tied the bows too firmly that morning. She had also brushed Rachel's hair until it obeyed, until it no longer looked like Rachel's. Everyone said she looked beautiful. Rachel thought she looked like a lie. Unter her skirt. Her hands hid, her left palm covered her right fist. Inside that fist was the small brown bottle. It was smooth and cold and sharp around the cap, its ridges biting half circles into her skin. The pressure kept her awake. The pressure said, "Remember." She did not loosen her hold. At the front of the hall, Miss Glattis stood behind a podium, dressed with flowers and candles. But it looked expensive in the lights. She had always been good at looking right. Her dress was black and simple, not one strand out of place. Her eyes glistened as if sorrow had been painted there with a brush. Grace was more than a friend, Glattis said softly. Her voice trembled just enough to sound true. The room leaned forward to listen. A chair creaked. A phone buzzed and went quiet. Rachel watched her mouth form the words, saw the corners lift with the shape of a smile too gentle, too rehearsed. The sound of that voice slid under Rachel's skin like cold water. Her father sat on the first row, a program folded in his hands. He kept creasing and smoothing the same corner. He did not look up. His eyes were red. Aunt Margaret sat beside him, straight back, her hands still, her purse closed like a safe. The pastor stood by the flowers, head bowed, waiting his turn to speak. Glattis lifted a glass of water from the podium, touched the rim with her fingers, then set it back down. She was kindness itself, she said. She took care of everyone. Afame. Rachel's throat closed. She stared at the picture on the easel beside the podium. Her mother's face, warm and alive in the frame. The smile that could light an entire kitchen, Grace's smile. Her mother's eyes were brown and soft, and in them there had always been something that made Rachel feel seen, even when she was quiet. Now the picture seemed to be looking through the room, past all the words that didn't fit. Glattis dabbed her eyes with a tissue that stayed perfectly white. She invited me into her home, she continued. She let me share her family, and I will spend the rest of my life honoring that gift. Rachel's stomach tightened. The word honoring hurt. It sounded like what people said when they were proud of a theft. The brown bottle dug deeper into her palm. She remembered the smell that had come from it once, bitter and green, like crushed leaves and something sharp. She had not known the name printed on the label back then. Now she did, Digitalis. Her mother's nurse had said it softly in the hospital, as if saying it too loud could wake something dangerous. The candle nearest her seat hissed, and a thin thread of wax slid down its side. The sound was tiny, but it broke the moment. Rachel counted her heartbeats to stop shaking. She felt the weight of her locket against her skin. It was small and silver, smooth from years of being touched. Inside was a picture of her mother and another of herself from school, smiling in a crooked way that now seemed wrong. She pressed the locket flat with her wrist. Glattis was still talking, her voice finding its rhythm. She taught me love without boundaries, she said. She showed me how a home could feel. The words filled the room like fog. Rachel's father looked up at last. His lips moved, maybe forming the word yes, or maybe forming her name. Rachel could not tell. He did not see her watching him. Aunt Margaret's face stayed still, eyes fixed on Glattis, unblinking. A glass clinked as someone shifted. Rachel could hear everything. The hum of the air conditioning, the soft rustle of clothes, the wet sniff of someone behind her trying not to cry. Every sound seemed too big, too loud. She thought about the kitchen again, about the sound of a ladle scraping the bottom of a pot, about the way her mother's laugh used to fill that sound and make it human. Then she thought of the night that sound had changed, when it had become something colder. Glattis lifted her glass again. To Grace, she said, "May her love live on in us." The guests raised their glasses. The room drew a single breath together. The movement made the candles bend. For a second, the flame shadows trembled across the ceiling, and then a glass slipped from somewhere near the back. Hitting the tile with a sharp crash, it shattered into a dozen small lights that died one by one. The sound hung in the air. No one spoke. The air seemed to pause, thick and listening. Rachel stood up. Her chair legs scraped against the floor. The sound was not loud, but it carried. Heads turned. The pastor straightened. The people in the nearest row shifted their feet. Rachel felt the world open in front of her like a hallway she had to walk. The carpet under her shoes was soft and steady. She could see her mother's photograph across the room. The space between them was made of air and fear. Miss Glattis saw her. For a heartbeat, something flickered behind the woman's calm mask. A flash of irritation or maybe recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by concern. "Sweetheart," Glattis said gently, "come here. Darling, sit with your father." Rachel didn't move. Her father had started to rise. His hand lifted slightly, palm open, as if he meant to stop her or catch her. His eyes were full of worry, the kind that could mistake a wound for misbehavior. Aunt Margaret's fingers rested on her knees. She did not speak. Rachel took another step forward. Her knees shook once and then held. She felt the bottle in her hand pulse with her heartbeat. The cap's teeth pressed deeper. She wanted to throw it, to break it. But that was not the plan. Aunt Margaret had said, "Wait for the right moment." But the right moment was here. It had found her. "You're lying," she said. The words were small but clear. They landed in the silence like stones dropped into water. Glattis froze. The smile stayed, but it had lost its shape. "Honey," she began, her voice sweet but thin. "You're upset. It's been a hard week. You're confused." "No," Rachel said. Her voice did not shake this time. "You're the one who's confused. She didn't trust you. She knew what you were doing." People began to whisper. A man coughed and stopped halfway through. The pastor's eyes darted toward Rachel's father. Her father stepped into the aisle, his face pale. "Rachel, come here," he said quietly. "It's all right. Let's go home." Rachel looked at him. His voice sounded like safety, but she could see Glattis watching him, could see how the woman's shoulders relaxed at his words. If Rachel went now, that relaxation would win. The bottle would mean nothing. Her mother would stay dead for no reason. She took another breath, tasted wax and dust and flowers. She pointed at the podium. "She's not who you think she is," she said. "She hurt Mom." The candles flickered again. The glass of water on the podium trembled. Glattis's hand twitched. "That's enough," she whispered. "You don't know what you're saying." Rachel's locket shifted as she breathed. The metal was warm now, pulsing with her heartbeat. She thought of her mother's last night at home, the bowl of soup on the tray, the way her hand had trembled as she lifted the spoon. She thought of the way Glattis had smiled then, soft and careful. She thought of the smell from the pot, bitter and wrong. She stepped forward once more. The words came out clean, steady, each one built on the next. "You killed my mom?" No one moved. The sentence seemed to fill the hall and hold it still. The candles burned without flicker. The hum of the air conditioning vanished under the sound of breathing that was not breathing. Miss Glattis's face emptied. The color left her lips. Her hand opened, then closed again around the glass. It tapped the wood of the podium. Tap, tap, like a clock that had forgotten what time meant. Rachel didn't cry. She just stood there, small and certain, her hands hidden, her fingers numb around the proof she could not yet show. The bottle pressed a perfect circle into her palm. The pain was the only warm thing she had left. Silence held its breath after the sentence that had split the air. The candles went on working, soft engines of fire, whispering as their wicks surrendered and stood up again. The lilies exhaled their sweet heaviness as if to argue that sorrow should smell pretty somewhere. A shoe sighed against the floor. The room behaved as rooms do when the thing that should not be said has already been said and cannot be coaxed back. She already stole the brown bottle from Miss Glattis's purse last week. That truth did not float. It sat inside Rachel like a post hammered deep into the ground. It had weight and edges, and the edges pressed into her palm now. Cap ribs, making crescent moons she would carry out of this hall, and into whatever came next. Her father spoke her name the way a man might speak to a sparrow perched at the opening of a hand. "Come down. Not now, please." His voice was gentle, and it frightened her, because gentleness could be a trap when it steered you away from the one door you had to walk through. Miss Glattis let concern pour over her face like warmed syrup. She lowered her lashes as if grief had made them heavy, then raised them again, as if strength were a favor she had decided to grant the room. "It is all right," she told the mourners, and her tone suggested that authority lived in her mouth. She said they were all hurting. She said the child was confused. She said the right words in the right order, as if reading music written for a funeral. Rachel's hand did not loosen. The bottle was cold, the way a river stone is cold even at noon, holding to its own weather. She felt the seam where cap kissed glass, that thin ring that gives a little and then bites, the place where a turn can become a lock. Her fingers remembered their first conversation with it, the way glass woke skin and skin woke thought, and the world tilted. Not much, just enough to make the floor a little strange and the air a little sharp. It had been an afternoon that pretended to be ordinary. Garlic and tomatoes made the kitchen smell like a promise. The guest bathroom shower hissed the way showers do when someone is preparing a performance. Miss Glattis liked to come upstairs already fresh, already composed, already scented like a decision. She did not wear the kitchen the way Grace wore the kitchen. The purse had been set on the counter, open mouth waiting, careless in the way that is not careless at all. Rachel had stood where carpet met tile, the seam under her toes like a commandment. The tiles held warmth as if the room had kept a memory of sunlight. The air was still. The refrigerator sang a thin metallic song. The water in the guest bath hammered, and then went smooth, the way rain tries the windows before committing. She had lifted the purse flap with 2 fingers, the way you lift a page you should not be reading but must. Inside, life paraded itself as proof of innocence. A wallet with a proud clasp, a tube of lipstick, the color of watered cherries, a tissue packet with its top corner peeled back, a key ring that glittered, mints whispering their stale cool through paper. Her eyes did not search for the bottle. Her hand did. It went to glass, as if drawn by the memory of another night, and another pot and a cap that had clicked once and sealed. The glass was cooler than anything else in the room. When she closed her fingers around it, the cool walked up her arm and settled at her shoulder like a quiet cat. She slid the bottle into the pocket of her skirt, felt its small weight make her leg true. The shower stopped. Pipes coughed. She put the purse back the way it had lain. The strap curved as if a shoulder still remembered it. Then she moved down the hall with the particular calm of a child who knows running would turn the air into an alarm. In her room, she opened the stubborn desk drawer until it squealed its old complaint, The smell of wood dust and pencil shavings and crayon paper rose like the breath of a cupboard. She pushed aside a math worksheet with eraser scars, a drawing of a cat shaped like a potato with ears, a postcard from a museum with a dinosaur frowning at a cloud. She set the bottle under the papers, glass touching pulp, and slid the drawer shut. The scrape sounded like a bolt sliding home. Later, in her mother's office, with the window light falling in a square over the carpet and the faint scent of tea and hand cream, making the air gentle, she took a picture of the label with the old phone that still lived on the desk. Her hand shook once and obeyed when she told it to be still. Letters showed themselves on the screen, upright and thin and sure. She did not know all they meant then. She knew enough. She wrote the time on a page with the carefulness her teacher had demanded for anything that mattered. She wrote the hour as words, because that is how children name the moment when something divides a life. She had called Aunt Margaret from that same room, after night had folded itself over the windows and the apartment had turned into a ship in a dark ocean. She had said the name she could not separate from poison now. She had said, "I saw it." She had said, "I have it." She had listened to her aunt's voice slow and steady itself, like someone building a bridge in the rain. "Keep it hidden. Do not tell him yet. I will move the lab faster. You are brave. I am coming." Those sentences had wrapped around her like a coat. Now, in the bright hall, with candles making their tidy sounds and wax sliding down like small white tears, adults did what adults so often do. They reached for arrangement. They reached for later. They reached for a version of truth that could be put on a shelf until it forgot what it was. Her father opened his hand toward her again. The gesture was a plea and a shield. He thought he was saving her from embarrassment, or from cruelty, or from whatever word people use when they do not want to say danger. He did not see the other saving she was doing, the kind that does not look like safety at all because it refuses to retreat. Miss Glattis offered help in a voice braided from silk and pity. "Come with me. Just us. Let me protect you." The word protect brushed Rachel's skin backward, the wrong way, like static. Protect felt like a palm pressed to the back, while a mouth said, "This is guidance." Protect felt like a blanket lowered over a face, while a voice called it warmth. Rachel kept her eyes on the framed photograph of her mother to steady the tilt. Grace's smile in that picture had always done a strange thing to the light around it. Even now, the smile made shadows seem like choices. The smile made the room less sure of its own edges. Rachel swallowed. The locket against her collarbone warmed and cooled with her breath. She did not touch it. She did not need to. It knew the path of her pulse. She thought of the soup again. The way steam had climbed a ceiling that could not hold more sadness. The way a spoon had trembled in a hand that had never dropped anything on purpose in a kitchen. She thought of the night noise a cat makes when it decides to close, a small animal sound in a room that otherwise holds only ordinary noises. She remembered Gladys's shoulder bending as she carried the bowl, the exact amount of gentleness on her face, the exactly right worry, the exactly right care. Rachel did not lift the bottle yet. She wanted to. Her fingers burned from wanting. But there is an order to truth when truth is not a speech, but a small, hard thing you must escort through a crowd. First, you teach the room that a child can stand and speak without asking permission. Then you make the room listen. Only then do you open your fist. The room listened now. It might have called what it was doing suspense or horror, or simply the inability to breathe. It did not matter. The listening had begun. It moved like cold through cloth. Aunt Margaret did not give a sign, because signs are for people who doubt. She sat with her hands on her knees like anchors, eyes steady, mouth quiet. Rachel borrowed that stillness. The way you borrow a coat when the wind changes, and you must walk anyway. Her father said, "We can talk at home." And the word home broke open in Rachel, the way a dropped plate breaks open. Inside it lived pancakes and a blue couch, and the lamp by the window, and the sound her mother made when a joke landed late and still made her laugh. But inside it also lived the hollow where sweaters were not, the wrong shelf for a favorite mug, the chair by the window occupied by a woman who arranged her kindness like silverware. Home could not be the place where truth went to sleep. Not today. Rachel straightened until the dress stopped touching her knees and became just another thing she could ignore. She breathed through the flower air and the candle air and the old wood air, and made a space inside herself where none of those smells lived. She found the sentence her mother had tucked into her weeks ago, and she set it down in the hall with care. "I am speaking," she said. She did not add, "please." She did not add, "listen." The words knew their work. Miss Glattis blinked slowly, as if closing a door in a house no one else had been invited to enter. When she opened her eyes again, they glittered with new tears that were so well behaved they did not fall. She touched the water glass. It tapped the wood. A small, clean sound, a metronome for a mask. "You are hurting," she said. "Let me protect you." Rachel thought of the first time she had seen her mother protect a small thing. Grace had turned the handle of a pan away from the edge and said, "This is how we keep what we love from falling." She had moved danger a hand's width and changed the world. The memory slid into place like a key. She turned her face a fraction toward her aunt. Not enough to break the line between her and the photograph. Aunt Margaret did not move, and somehow that was an answer. Stillness can say yes when yes would break. The room had warmed. Candles do that, and people do that. Across the aisle, a woman in black bent to gather glass into a napkin, and each shard spoke when it met its neighbor. A phone on silent trembled again. A moth behind fabric. No one moved to save it. Rachel's palm throbbed. She eased her grip without loosening it, letting the cap teeth seat themselves into the tiny valleys they had made, like a key remembering its lock. She wanted to show the thing. She would show it. Not yet. Not until her voice had built enough floor to carry it. Her father said her name once more, softer, with the beginning of something changed in it, a sound that had heard a flake of truth, and admitted it was flake and not ash. He was still far away. He was still on a shore that could not imagine another country. But he had looked up, and that mattered. Rachel lifted her chin the smallest measure. When she spoke again, the room did not swallow it. The room received it. "I will tell the truth," she said. She did not promise. She announced. The sentence stepped out of her and into the space between podium and aisle, and made itself a bridge plank. The next thing could cross on that. The bottle waited, cold and certain, and she waited with it, because truth asks for patience before it asks for courage, and she belonged to both. The sound from the podium, glass-tapping wood, folded itself into something older in Rachel's memory. The hall, with its candles and lilies, drifted away until only that small metallic ring remained. It belonged to a kitchen that still had warmth, to a night when life had begun to change shape without anyone noticing. It began on a Tuesday that pretended to be ordinary. The sun leaned through the apartment windows in long gold stripes. Rachel sat at the table with a pencil and a worksheet, her handwriting a mix of neat and almost neat. From the kitchen came her mother's voice, alive and bright. A melody in motion sounded out. "Love," Grace said, "reservoir. Think of the fancy way we say lake." Rachel grinned. "Fancy like French fries." Grace laughed. "Full and clean. Fancier than that. Maybe like soufflé." The laugh turned into a cough. Just one, short and sharp, but strange enough to still the air. Rachel looked up. The pencil slipped from her fingers and rolled off the table. "Mom, I'm fine," Grace said, straightening. A hand on the counter. Wrong pipe. She smiled, though her voice scraped a little. The spoon she held tapped the pot. The sound rang steady again, as if to prove the world still worked. But that cough came back 2 nights later, and then again after that, each time a little longer, a little rougher, until Rachel learned to stop asking if everything was okay. When Gideon came home that Friday, his suit jacket looked heavy on his shoulders. He set his briefcase by the door and smelled like cold air and train steel. "My girls," he said, and Rachel ran into his arm. For a moment, the world fit together again. Dinner waited on the stove, chicken and rice. Grace's quiet magic. Gideon kissed her cheek, eyes soft. "You look tired." Grace smiled, that small, tilted smile that never quite reached her eyes anymore. Brains can't run on fumes forever. Just a long day. They sat, ate, and laughed where laughter still worked. Rachel told them about her spelling test. Grace smiled again, though her spoon paused midair. When the coughing started once more, the doctor said stress, he said rest, he said fluids and vitamin. His voice had certainty's rhythm, but not its heart. Grace nodded through it all, grateful for words that promised there was nothing to fear. Then, one afternoon, the doorbell rang. Rachel opened it because her father was at work and her mother was asleep on the couch. Miss Glattis stood in the hall with a wicker basket on her arm and a smile already prepared. "I heard coughing," she said, her voice soft and clean. "I made soup." Rachel hesitated. The hallway light bent behind Glattis, turning her shadow long and thin on the carpet. "She's resting," Rachel said. "Then I'll be quiet," Glattis answered. Stepping inside, she smelled like lavender and soap, her heels clicking a rhythm that didn't belong in their apartment. Her eyes found the bookshelf, the family photos, the mug on the counter with yellow flowers painted on its side. Her fingers brushed its handle, light as dust, then turned it so the painted side faced the room. "That's better," she said under her breath. When Grace woke, she found the woman already ladling soup into bowls, humming a small tune. "You shouldn't be on your feet," Glattis said. "You need rest. Let me help." From then on, she was always helping. She came with groceries, folded laundry, wiped the counters, adjusted the salt by an inch, as if order were kindness. Her hands always moved, rearranging, straightening, claiming. Rachel began to notice things missing or moved. The blue mug changed shelves. The framed photo of her mother at the lake turned half an inch left. Her mother's pen sat capped on a different page of her notebook, none of it big enough to name, just enough to make Rachel's stomach turn when she walked into a room. One night, Rachel woke to the sound of the ladle scraping metal. It came again. Scrape. Then a pause. Then scrape again. She held her breath and listened, her locket pressed against her chest, cold and steady. She slipped out of bed, her feet finding the quiet parts of the floor. She knew where the wood complained, and where it didn't. The kitchen light poured across the hallway carpet, steam lifted in a soft column. Rachel stopped at the corner. From there, she could see half of Glattis, her shoulder, the fall of her hair, the smoothness of her back. She was stirring something slowly, methodically, as though the soup needed convincing. The scrape of metal on steel again, but this time softer, as if the spoon had teeth. Rachel held the wall with one hand. The clock on the microwave glowed green. AuraStories-s. The numbers looked alive, breathing faintly. Her mother's cough came from the bedroom, a low, dry sound, ending in silence. Then Gideon's voice, "You all right?" A pause. Grace answered, thin and tired. "Yes. Just..." Something stuck. Miss Glattis didn't look up. She poured the soup into a small bowl, covered it with a towel, and moved the pot to the back burner. She turned the salt again, just a 1/4 inch, and set the ladle down with a careful click. Rachel pressed herself tighter to the wall. The air smelled like thyme and something sharper, something her nose didn't have a name for. The locket rose and fell with her breath. She didn't know if the shaking in her chest was fear or anger or both. When Glattis finally left the kitchen, her heels silent on the floor, Rachel stayed where she was. The apartment had gone still again. She stepped into the kitchen. The pot was cooling, a faint layer of steam sliding off the lid. On the counter, the mug with the yellow flowers sat turned outward once more. She reached out and touched it. It was warm. After that, Rachel started watching more closely. She saw Glattis whisper in her father's ear while Grace slept. She saw her hand rest too long on his shoulder. She saw her smile stretch wider when he thanked her. And when Grace tried to rise, Glattis would say, "Sit, please. Let us take care of you." Her mother obeyed. Her mother always obeyed. By the end of the week, the color had left Grace's face. The laughter had thinned. She moved slower, like she was carrying invisible water in her lungs. Gideon started calling home from work to check in. Glattis was always the one to answer. "She's resting," she would say. "I'm keeping an eye on her." Rachel began to count the days by the sounds, the scrape at night, the whisper of fabric as Glattis moved through rooms that weren't hers, the cough that came less like a cough and more like the body trying to remember air. The nights stretched longer. The house felt heavier. The smell of soup became a warning. Then came the phone call. Rachel had been on the couch, pretending to draw. Glattis stood by the window, her back turned, her voice low and calm. "I'm telling you," she said, "it won't be much longer." Rachel's pencil stilled. She didn't breathe. Grace coughed again from the bedroom. The sound was a shadow now, barely there. Glattis turned her head slightly toward the sound, then back to the window. "Yes," she said softly. "I know. I'll call you after." The line clicked. The air shifted. Rachel stood up and walked to the door, loud enough that her shoes made sound. "I'm home," she called. Glattis turned with the practiced smile already waiting. "Sweetheart, I was just closing the window." "It's too chilly for your mom." Rachel nodded. She walked to the table, put her drawing pad down, and sat. The crayon snapped in her fingers. That night, the scrape returned, the ladle on metal, slow, steady, final. Rachel slid from bed. She crept down the hall, the locket pressing against her collarbone, the apartment holding its breath. The kitchen light glowed again, softer this time, more secret. Steam drifted in a lazy curve toward the ceiling. Miss Glattis moved with the patience of a ritual. Her hand lifted something small from her purse, glass glinting under the light. She tilted it. The sound of liquid meeting liquid. Quiet, precise, absolute. Rachel froze. Her pulse became the only sound she could hear. The cap turned. Once, click. The noise was delicate and complete, like a door closing forever. Glattis placed the bottle back into her purse, adjusted the towel on the pot, and turned off the burner. The soup shimmered faintly, an innocent thing. She looked around once, eyes sweeping the room, and for a heartbeat, Rachel thought she looked straight at her. But the woman only smiled to herself and whispered, "Perfect." Then she walked away, light-footed, humming the same small tune as before. Rachel stayed in the shadow until the humming was gone. The clock still said 21. Chassé. The pot still breathed. The scrape had stopped. The apartment had learned a new kind of quiet. She pressed her hand over her locket and felt its cool heart. In the other hand, she held her breath, as if it might be proof. The kitchen had the kind of quiet that pretends to be harmless. Steam rose in thin white threads, each strand unrolling toward the ceiling like a promise written slowly. The light above the stove drew a square on the tile, a pale island from the hall. The rest of the apartment watched without moving. Rachel stood within the edge, where shadow met light, and taught her breath to be small. The hour on the microwave glowed in patient green, and in her mind she said it the way a teacher would want, each word clear and separate. 21:14. She repeated it again, the way you repeat a spelling word until it stops slipping. The numbers did not argue, the room held still, as if stillness could make a predator blink and pass by. On the stove the pot exhaled. The ladle rested against the rim in a pose that looked obedient, as if it had never made a sound sharp enough to lift the hairs on her arms. Miss Glattis stood with her back to the hall. The set of her shoulders was precise, the kind of posture that says, "I am careful, even when no one is looking." Her hair made a dark line against the light. Her breath came evenly, almost a hum. Rachel felt the locket cool at her collarbone. The chain brushed the soft hollow at her throat whenever she swallowed. She told her feet not to step forward. She told her hands not to shake. She told her eyes to see everything and remember it exactly, because memory would be the only friend allowed to speak later. Miss Glattis reached for her purse, where it sat by the backsplash, the mouth of it open in a soft yawn. The gesture was unhurried, a dancer's hand moving to a mark on the floor. Tissues shifted with a faint, papery sigh. Keys clicked once against one another, and then were still. Her fingers found glass and drew it up from the dark like a small fish lifted from a pond. The bottle showed itself, brown and sure and cool even from a distance. The label caught the light, black letters, clean as a ruler line. Rachel did not breathe. She let the air sit inside her chest and wait. Miss Glattis tilted the bottle. A thread of liquid slid into the ladle, then into the soup below. The sound it made was almost nothing, only the tiniest change in how steam spoke when it touched what it did not expect. The hand shook, not with doubt, but with the small care of someone measuring something the way they have measured it before. The liquid disappeared into the surface, as if it had always belonged there. The soup shivered once and smoothed its face. The cap turned between practiced fingers. It closed with a single, neat surrender, a tiny sound that carried farther than it should have. The click stepped inside Rachel's skull and shut a door behind it. She would know that sound forever. She would hear it in quiet rooms and remember this square of light and the steam that wrote soft letters no one could read. Miss Glattis set the bottle down on the counter for the length of one breath, as if admiring the way glass keeps its secrets. Then she slipped it back into the purse and arranged the innocent things around it so they hid it like friendly neighbors. The purse closed. Its zipper made a patient metal whisper. She lifted the ladle once more, stirred as if blessing the surface, then wiped the spoon with a folded towel and laid it precisely beside the stove. She looked around the kitchen the way people do when they are certain they have left nothing out of place. Her gaze passed over the salt, over the blue mug, with yellow flowers now turned toward the room like a face, over the stack of folded dish towels that seemed to stand at attention. For a moment, Rachel thought those eyes would find the hall's shadow and hook her there. For a moment, the breath in her chest tried to run, but the gaze slid away. The mouth, that tidy mouth that could knit sympathy on command, softened. "Perfect," she whispered, so quiet that the word felt like a hand pressed flat against warm glass. She took the bowl, covered it with a towel, and moved down the hall toward the bedroom where Rachel's father murmured, and her mother coughed like paper. The apartment swallowed the soft rhythm of her steps. The light over the stove trembled once and held steady. Rachel stayed where she was until the steam thinned and the square of tile cooled by a degree only her skin could name. Then she stepped into the kitchen, each footfall placed the way a person places words in a promise. She did not touch the pot. She did not touch the ladle. She lifted her eyes to the microwave and said the hour again in her head, slow and clear. 2114. She spoke it to the cabinets and the counter and the small scrape in the grout line and made each thing hold a syllable for her. Back in bed, she lay on her side and watched the dark like a door that might open the wrong way. Sleep walked past her room several times and chose other places to rest. When morning took the blinds in its hands and tilted them, the light it poured in felt faded at the edges. Grace tried to rise, and her breath moved like someone walking uphill with a heavy book. In the kitchen, Rachel held a glass of water with both hands to quiet the clink, and the ring touched her lip with its hospital taste. "We should go in," her father said, voice low as if loud might fracture the table. "We should go now." The hospital wore its white-like armor. Machines watched with green eyes that blinked without lid. Thin cords carried beeps to small mouths that spoke only in even measures. A nurse wrapped an elastic band around Grace's arm and wrote neat numbers on a clipboard. The bed made a soft sound when weight changed. The word monitoring arrived and sat with them like an elderly aunt who would not leave because she had nowhere else to go. Rachel perched on a chair that leaned a little to the left. The way a boat leans when the water it floats in is not entirely sure of its own depth. The beep put a small fence around each second. Silence lived in the spaces between those fences and stalked the room. Curious, her father's hand felt colder than his wedding ring, which lay in a plastic cup on the windowsill, like a promise waiting for instructions. Miss Glattis entered wrapped in careful sympathy. She placed coffee in Gideon's hands and her voice on his shoulder. "I am here," she said. "We will get through this." The words were smooth stones rehearsed in a pocket. She dabbed at eyes that did not threaten to spill. The tissue she used looked soft enough to believe, but came away clean. Doctors came with their precise faces and left with their precise reassurances. They said, "Heart and stress, and not yet, and we will see." They set down the phrase "next hours," as if time were a bowl they could slide across the table toward the family and ask them to hold without spilling. They were allowed to see Grace for 1 minute. The minute stretched and snapped and stretched again. The machines sang their even song. Rachel touched the blanket where her mother's hand lay pale and warm and not warm enough. Brown eyes opened the width of a breath. "Tell the truth," her mother whispered, the words nearly weightless, and still somehow heavy enough to press a life into a shape. Rachel nodded. The minute ended with the sensation of a page being turned by a careful thumb. They went home because there was nothing else the day would allow. The apartment looked over-tidy, like a photograph of itself. The towel on the oven had its seams perfectly even. The salt sat exactly centered. The blue mug faced out as though posing. Gideon lay down in his shoes and covered his eyes with his forearm. His breath sounded like rope pulled through a ring. Rachel stood in the doorway until she understood that kindness could be quiet, then turned away. In the kitchen, the pot had been washed and inverted, a shining circle of water drying on its bottom like a polished coin. The drawer by the stove was open by the width of a whisper. She closed it with 2 fingers and listened to the tiny hush it made, like a secret putting itself back together. The guest bathroom began to sing its bright spray. That meant the ritual of looking new before the evening performance. Rachel walked to her room on feet that had learned the board. She opened her desk drawer with the care of someone adjusting a crown. Paper breath rose. Her notebook waited. She wrote the hour in words, the day in word, the room in word, and the sound in a single small word that still managed to take up too much space. Click. She underlined it once, and then again because underlines can behave like rope when you need them to. She waited until the spray stopped, and the pipe sighed, and the towel whispered across skin. Then she went to the kitchen. The purse sat where it had sat the night before, its mouth open. The innocent things gathered around their secret like good neighbors in a storybook. Rachel lifted the bottle gently, the way you lift a truth that could shatter if anyone shouted at it. The glass was cold, holding its own weather again. The label kept its letters straight and thin. She read them once, twice, a third time, until they sounded like a line of soldiers standing at attention. She angled the bottle toward the window's light without letting the glass flash. She traced its outline on a blank page so the shape would exist somewhere that could not be confiscated by clever hands. In her mother's office, the old phone slept on the desk. She woke it, held the camera square over the label, and let it see. The shutter made no sound, as if it understood the rules of this house. In the corner of the little screen, the hour wrote itself in green. She said it softly, 21:14. Then she slid the phone into the notebook's pocket, folded the page over the drawing of the bottle, and breathed out. Back in the kitchen, she put the glass back into its dark and gave the mints back their neat arrangement. The keys, their clatter, the lipstick its direction. She closed the purse and asked it silently to keep behaving as if it had never learned a new purpose. When Miss Glattis stepped into her doorway a few minutes later, curls glossy, lips politely pink, smile tuned to comfort, Rachel sat on her bed with her hands quiet in her lap. "How is our brave girl?" the woman asked, as if ownership could be smuggled inside a pronoun. "Fine," Rachel said, the word clean and thin as a piece of glass. The locket lay against her skin and did not move. That night the hospital drew the line that would not unwind. That belongs to another telling. Here, in the bright shadow of the kitchen, and the careful practice of a woman who rearranged the world by inches, Rachel had done what the hour required. The plan lived now not as a speech, but as a small hard map, a time remembered, a label captured, a lot code copied in neat strokes, a bottle traced onto paper, a drawer that closed with a low wooden sigh, and a child's promise that did not need to be loud to be binding. She slid the notebook into the drawer and pushed until the scrape softened and the front met the frame. The sound was almost nothing, but she felt it anyway, the way a key feels its own lock. The hospital day pressed flat and would not move. Beeps fenced the seconds in patient inches, and each footstep learned to whisper. Rachel sat at the edge of a chair that leaned a little left, her fingers locked white around the vinyl, as if holding on could stop time from sliding. An elevator bell chimed down the corridor like a thin coin against glass. She looked up. A woman stepped out with a small suitcase that hummed over the seam in the floor, and a canvas tote gripped close to her ribs. Her coat wore the soft creases of flight. Her eyes were Grace's brown, shadowed by travel, and by the kind of sleep that never arrives. She saw Rachel first, then Gideon. As if her gaze had been trained to find family before walls or light, Aunt Margaret crossed the distance without wasting a breath. When she reached the girl, she knelt, set both hands on Rachel's shoulders, and let her steady warmth rest there for one slow count. "Hey, honey," she said, voice low and certain, the kind that can sit on a cold surface and make it think again. Gideon stood so fast he had to catch the wall. "I did not know," he said, the words breaking in his mouth. "You were doing the only thing," Margaret answered, quick and gentle. She touched his sleeve once, then turned her attention to the monitors, with a small, readable nod, like a person greeting a familiar alphabet. A nurse appeared with a clipboard, and the hush of paper followed. Pens clicked. Margaret signed where signatures made doors stay open, and left blanks where blanks kept choices. Her pen made a clean note on the hard plastic, a sound like a tiny anchor dropped into dark water. "Let me see her," she said. The nurse nodded. 2 minutes. Margaret murmured to Rachel. Then you and I take a walk. The room held machines with green eyes and a careful voice. Margaret stood at the foot of the bed first, as if entering a chapel without ceremony, then came to Grace's side. She touched the blanket with 2 fingers in a gesture that said both permission and apology. "Hey, baby sister," she whispered, and the words thinned until they were little more than breath. Grace did not stir. The beeps did their even work. Back in the hall, the window gave pale paper light. "Walk," Margaret said, and the word parted the murmur of chairs and coats. They went no farther than the humming bank of vending machines where colors pretended normal. "Show me what you have," Margaret said, her eyes on Rachel, and then briefly on Gideon, who sat with his elbows on his knees, as if they were keeping him from falling. Rachel felt the locket cool against her collarbone. "I took a picture," she said, "last night." The words were too big inside her, and still they came out small. She handed over the old phone. Margaret woke the screen with careful fingers, held the device the way you cradle a fragile instrument. The labels stared up in kitchen light, letters spare and black. Margaret read with her lips moving, not for sound but for precision. "Digitalis," she said. Then the series under it in the same steady manner, Lot D-1, 7-I2, turned into a string of measured syllables. Her gaze slid to the corner of the frame. "Time stem," she said. 2114. The numbers lived in both their heads now, green and exact. Margaret's tote sighed open. She drew out a hard leather notebook and a pen that made a soft, weighted click. She wrote without flourish, a neat block of lines that would not wander. Drug name, lot notation, the kitchen and its one bright light, the hour written in letters. She slid the phone into a clear plastic sleeve. Before handing it back, the plastic strange and right beneath Rachel's fingers. "Chain," she said in a voice meant for this small square of air. "We begin it now. You never hand raw proof to anyone with a story to defend. Not a lecture. A rule." "Where is the bottle?" she asked, still gentle, still clinical. "In her purse," Rachel said. The word "her" made the air change, and they both noticed and walked past it. "On the counter when she showers. In the kitchen at night, she puts it back." "Good," Margaret said, her gaze tightening around the shape of the information. "Then it stays there. If it goes missing, she is careful, and we learn nothing. If it stays, she is sloppy and we learn everything. This we can move." She tapped the sleeved phone. Her own phone buzzed. One polite note. She read a name, and her posture shifted by a breath, the body language of a plan unfolding. "I know a lab," she said, already dialing. "An independent with clean habits." She spoke without stepping away. "This is Margaret Weller. I need a rush toxicology and serum quant on preserved samples already processed. Yes, I have the hospital specimen numbers and chain forms. Digitalis. The lot appears in a captured image. I will forward under seal today." She listened, fingers quiet on the tote's rim. "1 week," she said. "Sooner, if anything breaks in my favor, I will send a courier." She ended the call with a soft glass tap. "Will they have samples?" Rachel asked, her voice moving like a little boat on new water. "The hospital freezes what it does not trust yet," Margaret said. "I will get the requisitions. They will make noises about process. They will sign." She smoothed the girl's hair once. A straight line of comfort. "I cannot promise it will be okay. I can promise this part will be done right." Back they went. Margaret took forms without rudeness and returned them with initials that opened gates. She asked for the charge nurse by name and got her. She used the phone with the patience of someone who understands how clocks and people misbehave. The person on the other end started saying yes more than no. "Courier," she told Rachel, and the word made a small circle that contained relief. "Tonight, I will put the image on an encrypted drive. Send that with the requisitions. And keep this phone in my custody. They will log their receipt. We will log that they logged it. Chain of custody is a chorus. Everyone sings their line. The words arranged themselves beside the smaller shapes Rachel had made in her notebook, Lot D-17-A2. The hour spoken like a sentence, the click that would not stop living in her ear. Tonight, Margaret added, lowering her voice until it lived just above a whisper, I want to see your apartment. Only us. Gideon can rest. You will show me where the purse prefers to live. The day stretched from winter blue to winter gold, and then to the flat tint that happens when evening does not know how to be kind. Twice a doctor set language on the table like mismatched cutlery. Something about rhythm, something about electrolytes. The words stayed there and did not become a meal. At last, Gideon's phone rang, and he walked away to answer. Tomorrow, he said. We will see. The syllables did not hold their shapes. Now, Margaret said to Rachel, the word made a path. Outside the city wore its thin coat of cold. Their breath appeared in brief clouds and vanished where it began. They took a cab because speed sometimes feels like control even when it is not. The driver's radio murmured in a language of headlines. The apartment opened like a book pressed too flat. The towel edge on the oven hung ruler straight. The blue mug faced the room as if it were posing. The salt jar sat perfectly centered, a tiny moon placed by a careful hand. Margaret stood still for a full minute and said nothing. She took note of everything without touching anything. Then she set the tote on a chair and looked to Rachel. Where? She asked. Here, Rachel said, pointing to the counter by the backsplash. Here when she showers, here when she cooks. We do not open it without her in the house. Margaret said, we prove nothing by peeking and everything by patience. Tell me last night. Rachel did, showing with her hands the size of the bottle and the slide from purse to pot. She spoke the hour because the hour wanted to be said. Margaret wrote as the child spoke, capturing order, as if breath itself were ink. Now the plan, Margaret said. She opened the tote. Inside lay a narrow grammar of preparedness. A small drive in a clear case, 2 manila envelopes already marked for a courier, a roll of evidence tape slim as ribbon, a stack of chain forms with tiny boxes waiting for initials, no drama. Only parts. She slid the sleeved phone into an envelope, added a printed copy of the label image she had already pulled from a hospital email and sealed the flap. Her finger moved once along the glue. Evidence tape crossed the seam in a quiet cross. On the form she wrote what went in, when, by whom, for whom. She printed her name and signed with a promise that had corners. Tonight, a courier, she said, 2 signatures there and 2 here. Tomorrow I meet pathology and sign for frozen serum. Another courier, another chain. She stacked the forms as if they were bridges and returned them to the tote. The front door opened, and the hall's cool air strode in with Gideon. Is everything all right? He asked, as if the word had not been dissolving all day. We were making a list, Margaret said smoothly. Meals and laundry and the small gravity of houses. I will start a schedule. Thank you, he said to the air more than to the plan. I should go back. They said late. I will drive. Margaret answered. Rachel stays and sleeps. He hesitated, looked at his daughter, then at the tidy room he trusted because it looked like care. Lock the door, he said, and the sentence barely held. They left with the soft fuss of coats and keys. The apartment returned to its refrigerator breath. For a moment the place felt like a stage after a matinee, swept and waiting. Rachel stood inside the bright square of kitchen light and listened for what the room would say next. Water pipes sighed upstairs. A distant laugh track wandered down the hall and lost itself. The small paper calendar on the fridge showed a date that had learned how to be heavy. A key turned again. The door opened. Miss Glattis entered with the coat that fit like manners, and the smile tuned to sympathy. She paused when she saw Rachel alone. The surface of her face changed by a careful degree, the math of a new board arranged in her eyes. "Where is everyone?" she asked in a gentle tone, already holding the answer she wanted. "At the hospital," Rachel said. "They will be late." "Of course," murmured Gladys. She moved through the room in soft steps, adjusted the blue mug by a breath, straightened a dishcloth as if it mattered. The purse found its usual place on the counter with a quiet thump, the zipper a patient whisper. "I brought tea," she said, setting a box as if it were an offering. Rachel looked at the purse and then at the microwave clock and spoke the hour inside her head until it turned from numbers into words. Not yet, and soon were the only times the room would let her hold. "Why do you not rest?" Gladys said with that tilted kindness. "Big day tomorrow. I will finish the program." Rachel did not move. The drawer in her room remembered its scrape, and the notebook inside remembered the outline of a bottle, and somewhere in the city a courier was already putting an envelope on a cart. The chain had begun to sing in quiet voices she could not hear from here. She nodded once, not in agreement but in survival. Later, when the door closed and the apartment took back its air, she went to the desk, opened the drawer, and touched the notebook's cover with 3 fingers. Not to move anything, only to mark the moment the plan learned its date. 1 week, Aunt Margaret had said. The words sat down beside the hour, and the lot code, and the click, and together they made a small, careful fire that would keep through the night. Night laid a thin film over the apartment, the kind that turns every seam into a whisper. The refrigerator breathed like a patient animal. A pipe above coughed and settled. From her doorway, Rachel watched the hallway as if it might change shape when she blinked. In the kitchen, the purse waited by the backsplash, its zipper a narrow metal smile. It looked exactly as it always looked, which was the trick of it. Constancy can be a costume. The microwave clock glowed in the dark, but she did not speak the numbers. She did not want the apartment to think about time. Her room held the desk held the drawer held the notebook, and the notebook held the outline of a bottle traced by a small, careful hand. The old phone slept inside its clear sleeve like a wintered truth. She slid the drawer open, and wood whispered against wood. The scrape drew a neat line along her nerves, a little reminder that memory has a sound. She lifted the phone and held it flat in both palms. The plastic crackled softly. Even without unlocking the screen, she could see the label in her mind, where it had printed itself the night before. Black letters squared under kitchen light. Dashes like quiet hinges. She did not need to look again. She only needed the feel of the sleeve on her skin, the reassurance that proof existed in a thing that could be handed and signed. Water began to sing in the guest bath. Miss Glattis always started the shower high and steady, as if setting a note the house was required to keep. The sound moved through corners and settled on the tile. This was the moment the purse liked to be unguarded. It was also the hour when the rooms learned to preen themselves, every towel aligned, every cloth pressed, every mug turned forward. Clean can be a kind of threat. Rachel returned the phone to the drawer and eased it shut until the wood found the wood and the scrape thinned into a hush. She stepped into the hall with dry palms and quiet feet. Kitchen light made a small, obedient circle. Steam braided with cooler air and vanished. The purse waited, familiar as a habit. She stood at the threshold and listened to the water. Her aunt had called such sound a veil, noise you can move behind without being seen. She did not touch the purse. That was a rule now. Instead, she leaned closer until she could smell the faint, bitter ghost of tea leaves in the trash. With one finger she drew a tiny mark through the dusting of flour that clings to kitchens where baking has been loved. A thin white notch sat to the right of the purse, a chalk moon next to a leather shadow. If the bag moved even by a breath, she would know. Sometimes proof is a before and an after that the eye can show without words. The shower kept its pure note. She counted without counting, letting her pulse rise into her ears and fall again. The bathroom fan clicked on and joined the chorus. Her breathing learned the measure, fitting itself into the spaces between spray and hum and the refrigerator's loyal exhale. The apartment felt like a soft machine with 3 parts. Footsteps. The water stopped. Hush rang where the sound had been. A towel dragged across tile. A knob turned. Rachel let her hands fall to her sides. She tried a smile and abandoned it before it reached her mouth. She put on the small flat face she wore when pretending not to know. Miss Glattis came in cooled by steam, robe tied into a neat bow, hair combed into compliance. Her eyes flicked once to the purse where it always sat. If she saw the notch and flour dust, nothing in her face confessed it. She looked at the kettle, at the blue mug, at the salt jar placed with moon-like precision. Then she arranged kindness over her features the way a veil is laid and smooth. "You should be asleep," she said softly, as if night were an offered kindness, and Rachel had been rude to refuse it. "I will be," Rachel answered. The locket lay cool against her collarbone, a small coin with a promise. They shared the soft brightness for half a minute that felt wider than it was. Then Miss Glattis turned to the kettle with steps that measured the tile. The lid lifted with a light ring. Water ran in a pale ribbon. When she set the kettle on its base, and the little red eye blinked awake, her hand reached for the purse without looking. The way any hand finds a knob it is turned 100 times. The leather folded, and the zipper gave a practiced whisper. Tissues. Keys. A lipstick turned to face the right way. The brown bottle showed its glass throat, a slim shine tucked in shadow. Her fingers found it and did not fumble. She lifted it just enough to feel the weight of habit, just enough to reassure routine. Then she returned it to its pocket and drew the zipper closed, sealing the whisper inside. The kettle sighed itself toward boiling. Steam made a thread of white air. Miss Glattis turned, robe belt ends, brushing each other, and wore the second version of her smile, the one that suggests shared responsibility. "You must be very brave tomorrow," she said, as if offering a pact. She straightened a dishcloth that did not need her. "Your father needs you to be calm. He needs you to be kind to people who are kind to him." Rachel held very still. The locket pressed its cool agreement. "I can be calm," she said, and the words did not tremble. "Good girl," murmured Miss Glattis, like a hand dusting a sleeve. She poured the water over tea and breathed the dark scent. She sipped too soon, winced, rearranged her face, and smiled again. "Sleep now," she said, and even the little clicks beneath the kettle seemed to nod. Rachel carried herself back to her room like a glass filled to the brim. The door closed with the known softness of hinges that belong. In the dim she stood one breath, then crossed to the desk. She opened the drawer and let the scrape draw its neat line across the quiet. The phone waited inside its sleeve. She did not touch it. Her hands needed to learn stillness again, the way bodies sometimes need to be told that not every minute asks for movement. The air shifted by a degree, that tiny change you notice with your skin before any thought arrives. In that listening, she heard Margaret in the earlier afternoon, the word chain wearing its practical coat, the word courier wearing shoes with speed. "One knot more," she told herself. "One knot more in the rope." The house phone rested on her mother's desk with its old patience. She lifted the receiver and dialed the square digits Margaret had written on a lined card. Rings walked out into the city and came back. On the third sound, her aunt answered with a voice already built for the moment. "This is me," Rachel said, and the three words made a bridge. "Good," said Margaret. "The courier has the envelope. He signed for it." "I signed to say he signed. In the morning I take custody of preserved serum and send the second packet. Are you safe?" "Yes," said Rachel. "She is here." She checked the bottle. She put it back. I marked the counter. It did not move. Silence sat with them. Not empty, simply careful. "All right," said Margaret. "Keep the notebook in the drawer. Keep the phone in the sleeve. Keep your hands out of her purse. We do not need her to know about the mark. Sleep if you can. If you want me, ring once and hang up. I will be at your door in the time it takes to count to 10 groups of 60. "Okay," Rachel said, and the word found a place inside her that did not ache. The receiver settled into its cradle with the sound of a small door closing gently. Quiet climbed back over everything. The kettle stilled. The purse held its shadow. The drawer held its scrape. Later, the apartment chose to imitate sleep. Rachel lay on her side and watched the thin city gold rake the wall through the blinds, making ladder rungs she could have climbed if she were someone else. She counted until counting became breath. Upstairs, a laugh arrived and ended. The refrigerator breathed again, steady and loyal, as if keeping time for people who could not. Morning came as a pale correction. Air thinned, the way it does right before light. She rose before the clock drew its numbers and pressed her ear to the door. The hallway hummed with a neighbor's radio set low. In the kitchen, the purse kept its vigil. On the fridge, the paper calendar showed a dark mark on a square, with a name printed above it. Her eyes looked, and then moved to the blank days that waited beyond. A single knock, Margaret's knock, purposeful and modest. Rachel opened. Winter air slipped in around her aunt's sleeves. Margaret held a cup to go, and a folder tucked under her arm. She read the room the way some people read weather, her gaze catching on the angle of a towel, the set of a mug, the unbothered white notch in the fine flower. "Anything?" she asked. She touched it and put it back. Rachel said. The mark stayed still. "Good," said Margaret, and the word meant the plan had not been disturbed. "I have the requisition. A courier is downstairs. I meet pathology soon. Before we go to the hall, eat something, and keep space from her if you can. If you cannot, keep your words small and true, and let the room do some of the hearing." Rachel nodded. The locket, warmed by a breath, she opened the drawer once more, and let the scrape speak the morning's first word. The phone lay wrapped and ready. She did not lift it. Instead, she set 3 fingers on the notebook and felt the faint raised outline of the bottle through the cover, like a memory answering from the other side. She closed the drawer, sealing wood to wood with a small, decisive hiss, one plan joining another. In the kitchen, she poured cereal and listened to each flake land. Milk made its pale sound in the bowl. She swallowed because bodies must be taught how to continue. Gideon's coat hung on the chair like the memory of a hug. The apartment held itself very tidy, the kind of tidy that looks like care from a distance, and like erasure when you stand close enough to see the spaces where a life used to sit. Down the hall, the bathroom fan clicked on. Miss Glattis would be up soon. Hair in place, voice warmed, robe tied in its practiced bow. The purse would greet her. The little chalk moon would hold its mark. The chain had begun, and would keep moving through hands and signatures, and the narrow lines where initials go. In a week, the lab would sing its verse. Rachel ate 3 more careful bites. She did not picture the candles or the printed program with her mother's name turned elegant. She thought about the drawer and the scrape, the purse and its shadow, the small, honest marks you leave in a clean place, so the truth can find its way later. She thought about the cap's single click, a door closing in memory, and refusing to open. "Ready?" asked Margaret from the doorway, checking her watch and the folder and the world. Rachel rose. The locket swung once and settled. "Ready," she said. The word did not pretend to be brave. It only promised to move in the direction the plan had drawn. The apartment watched them with tidy eyes. The purse kept its place. The drawer kept its hush, holding a note you can hum under your breath until the moment comes when everyone will hear it. Afternoon lowered itself over the apartment like a fitted lid. Light slipped through the windows thin as rice paper, turning the dust into slow snow if a person let her eyes soften. Rachel did not soften her eyes. She watched the doorway and felt the locket cool against the small hollow at her throat, as if the metal were learning her pulse. Down the hall the elevator sighed and dinged, a tired bell in a tired throat. Footsteps came, polite against the runner, and the knob turned with its practiced click. Miss Glattis stepped in with a grocery bag hooked in the crook of her arm, and a smile shaped for sympathy. Winter rode in behind her, and a sweet perfume rode in front, a scent that wanted witnesses. She set the bag on the counter without looking, and moved through the space like someone who knew where every tile began. The purse went to its spot beside the backsplash and made its familiar landing, the small thump of an object whose rights have been rehearsed. She smoothed her hair with 2 fingers, turned, and walked toward the living room. Rachel saw it, and her skin saw it a breath sooner. The sweater, her mother's blue, the soft one that always kept a smudge of vanilla. No matter how the laundry tried to reason with it, on the left shoulder the seam carried a tiny loose thread. Her mother always meant to mend and never did. The thread waved hello in a room that had not invited it. Miss Glattis wore the sweater like it had grown there, sleeves pushed to the forearms, ready for work that did not belong to her. She did not ask. She did not explain. She crossed to the window and stood where Grace used to stand when the sun flattened against the glass and made the city look close enough to pick up. The sweater gathered the light and gave it back wrong. Rachel's throat tightened like a small fist. The locket felt heavier, as if memory could double its weight. She tried to swallow, and the swallow went nowhere. "Nice light today," Miss Glattis said in her hushed, church hallway voice. The sweater swallowed the words and wore them. She reached for the chair by the window. Not a chair, not today. The chair, the one with the rounded arms and the shallow dip in the cushion where Grace's shape had pressed itself into a kind of map. The pencil marks on the side table, the mug ring on the coaster, the tissue tucked under the leg to stop a wobble. No one else could hear. The chair knew its person. "Do not," Rachel said. Miss Glattis blinked as if a draft had brushed her cheek. "I beg your pardon." "Do not sit there," Rachel said. The air carried the words clean. They did not wobble. "It is only a chair," said Miss Glattis, wrapping the word "only" in tissue. "It is not only a chair," Rachel said. Her hands shook without anything in them to hold. "Please stand up." "Please is a beautiful word," said Miss Glattis, still seated, still soft. "We should all use it more." Rachel stepped closer. The loose thread lifted as if it wanted to be counted. The ache of it was a small bright pain. "Take it off," she said. "Take what off?" Miss Glattis asked, the question shaped like a kindness that had been taught to sit. "My mother's sweater," Rachel said. "This," said Miss Glattis, her fingers gliding along the sleeve as if petting a tame animal. "It was in the donation pile. Your father asked me to help. It comforts people to see familiar colors. He did not ask you to wear it," Rachel said, her voice thinning to wire. "He did not ask you to sit there." Miss Glattis looked toward the hall like the hall might produce Gideon with a permission slip. The hall did not oblige. A neighbor's radio murmured through a thin wall. Somewhere below a bus took a breath. She rose. "Not apologetics." Not abrupt. The sweater shivered, then settled. She smoothed the knit at the waist with both palms. She moved to the dining table and laid 3 fingers on the stack of memorial programs, grazing the glossy paper as if testing the temperature. Her hand came to rest on Gideon's folded notes. She lifted her eyes and fitted them around Rachel as if the girl were a folder to be labeled. "You are angry," she said. Warm milk poured into a cup. "Do not talk to me like that," Rachel said. The anger met a harder thing inside her and became a straight line. "Do not talk to me like I am messy." "Ah," said Miss Glattis, as if she had discovered a new spice in an old kitchen. She drifted back to the living room and chose the coffee table instead of the chair, perching on the edge with knees together, hands folded. The sweater, a sky she wanted to own. Her perfume sat over the room's breath, like plastic over a bowl. "Your father is doing his best," she said. "Grief turns houses into mazes. He needs someone to hold the thread." Rachel looked at the little loose thread at the shoulder seam and wanted to cut it off and keep it. "My father needs the truth," she said. "Truth is not a hammer we swing at the people we love," said Miss Glattis, almost laughing, almost kind. "Truth is timing. Truth is tone." She leaned in until Rachel could count the stitches. "He needs you to stop fighting the hands that help." Rachel did not step back. The locket pressed cold and steady. "I am not fighting help," she said. "I am fighting theft." The smile snapped off like a light. "What a heavy word," said Miss Glattis. She set it down between them and stared at it as if it were an insect she could name. Then 2 fingers found Rachel's chin. Not rough, not gentle, the way a person moves a lamp to see better. "Look at me," she said, the soft gone from her voice. "You will not speak to me like that in this home. Do you understand?" Rachel pulled free. "Do not touch me," she said. Her hands had stopped shaking without asking permission. The door opened. Aunt Margaret came in with 2 grocery bags and a sweep of honest winter in her hair. She took the room in a single breath. The sweater, the chair, the small distance between a child and a woman. Her expression cooled 1 degree, and that degree did the work of a storm front. "What is happening?" she asked. "We were choosing photographs," said Miss Glattis, voice back in its daytime costume. "Feelings are tender. Naturally. Take off the sweater," said Margaret. "No, please. No decoration." "Excuse me," said Miss Glattis, a tiny pin of laughter tucked where a lip meets a tooth. "Take off the sweater," Margaret said again. Silence pulled the room tight. For a slow count of heartbeats, nothing moved. Then Miss Glattis stood with a flourish that wanted to be read as generous. She pulled the sweater over her head, careful of hair, careful of angles. Beneath it, a black blouse caught the winter light and kept it. She folded the sweater once, twice, as if the knit might bruise, and set it on the back of the chair with a precise pat. "There," she said, the word placed like a paperweight. "Thank you," said Margaret. Her eyes did not leave the other woman's face. She reached for the sweater, folded it again, and slid it into a plain bag. Then to Rachel, without looking away, "Are you all right?" "I am," said Rachel, and inside the locket, warmth began to grow like a small sun that knew what work was. Miss Glattis offered the room a smile that could have been borrowed from a brochure. "I will see about the kitchen," she said. "We must keep moving." She walked away, leaving the sweater bagged like weather that had been captured and told to sit. Margaret set the groceries down and exhaled through her nose. She touched Rachel's shoulder, and the touch said all the sentences courtrooms, file, and houses. "Remember." The girl stood straighter. Margaret leaned in until breath warmed an ear. 3 days, she whispered. "The lab will have the answer. Not long now." 3 days sat on Rachel's tongue like a small stone. It did not stop her speech. It made it honest, They worked because work sits on top of pain and makes a table. Margaret sorted photographs with brisk hands that still found time to be gentle. She chose the frames that would not glare under candlelight and set aside the ones that would. She laid a runner across the dining table and measured with her eyes the distance between the edge and the truth. Rachel walked the room like a tide, putting shells back where the waves had dragged them. Her mother's blue mug returned to its ledge by the coffee maker, handle to the right like a habit. The beach photo moved forward again, her mother laughing with hair in her mouth and not minding. The wick on the bookcase candle turned forward to listen. The front door opened. Gideon came in carrying proofs, shoulders, brackets around a day that had not given what it owed. He saw the sweater bag on the chair and took a breath that bent in the middle. "Where did that turn up?" he asked, not really asking. "Donation pile," said Miss Glattis from the kitchen doorway. "I thought its color might soothe." "It makes the room smaller," said Margaret. She dropped the bag into a box without ceremony. "We will decide later. For now we handle what speaks plainly." Gideon nodded because agreement costs less than argument when a room is already full. He came to Rachel and set his palm lightly on her hair. A check of a temperature, a brief shelter. She leaned in for a single beat and then stepped away because leaning had become a permission slip. She did not want to sign. Water began to run in the kitchen for a dish that did not need cleansing. The sound made a thin wall. Over it, Miss Glattis spoke in a voice built for being overheard. "People will say the wrong names at the service. Gideon, they will tell stories that belong to themselves. We should guide the tone. We owe Grace that much. We will let them mourn." Gideon said, not sharp, only tired. "We can be gracious and still set the shape of what comes next," she said, drawing a clean plate. The words, "next chapter," fluttered in the air, and then, finding no flame to burn on, settled onto the sink. The urge to shout rose in Rachel, and then passed like a wave that decides not to break. She went to the desk instead. She opened the top drawer. The scrape said its trustworthy note. The notebook waited. She turned to a new page and drew a narrow rectangle until it darkened into a bottle. A shadow inside a shadow. Under it she printed the lot code in careful block letters. Each dash spelled in her head. Each letter said the way her aunt had said it. She closed the book. The drawer slid in with a small hiss. One plan sealing to another. Evening warmed itself to copper and laid hands on the frames. Margaret tucked selected photos into sleeves and wrote a list on the edge of a paper towel because truth does not require thick paper. Frame glass, candles, twine, courrier, receipt, copie. She tore the towel along a printed line and slid the strip into her folder like a little oath. Gideon weighed fonts that felt almost the same and chose the one that made her mother's name look like breath rather than marble. He looked at the bag again, and then away again, and then down at his hands, as if they might have the answer. As the day thinned, Miss Glattis drifted back to the living room. She paused by the chair and laid her fingers on the finished wood. As if testing for a pulse, she leaned toward Rachel and let her voice fall into the sweet register where sugar cools and hardens. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," she said. "It is not a threat. It is a prediction. Your father will remember who steadied him and who shook him. Which person do you choose to be?" Rachel turned her head until their eyes met at level ground. The locket touched bone and named her. "I will be the person my mother raised," she said. The sentence did not wait around for approval. It stood on its own legs. A blink, a recalculation, the smallest smile, the kind that never travels to any corner. "We shall see," said Miss Glattis. Cutting the ribbon on her private ceremony, she returned to the kitchen and folded a dry towel for no reason anyone could name. Night gathered in the glass, streetlights arriving like quiet witnesses. Lamps clicked on. The room put on its gentle uniform. Margaret sipped her folder, pressing the small strip of paper towel deeper inside, as if tucking in a child. She came to Rachel, brushed a stray hair behind the girl's ear, and bent until her mouth was right there. 3 days, she breathed. Warmth from the words touched skin, and then went inside to sit with the locket. Margaret straightened, put on her coat, and left with winter in her hands. Rachel stood in the doorway and watched the hall carry her aunt away. The elevator chimed. Somewhere a door closed, soft as a thought. The apartment inhaled for the night and held it. 3 days, Rachel repeated, not as fear, as a metronome. The locket lay steady. The chair kept its counsel. The sweater slept in a bag that made no sound. And the plan wrote its quiet line on the wall of her mind. The kind of line that cannot be scrubbed off without the whole room knowing you tried. Night leaned its forehead to the glass and listened for a reason to stay. The apartment answered with small household murmurs, the radiator's careful ticking, and a pipe soft clear of the throat. Rachel sat at her mother's desk, where the lamp poured a low honeycircle that did not push the shadows away so much as teach them to behave. Her palms rested flat on the wood, as if feeling for hearth heat that memory sometimes leaves behind. The locket lay against her collarbone, cool, then warm, as if it were practicing being a pulse. Beside her elbow, her mother's journal waited open on ordinary ink, the plain courage of a page that had allowed a feeling to stand on it. The old laptop hummed a gentle whir that sounded like a cat trying not to purr too loudly. She turned the brightness down until the room kept its depth. She breathed once, a square breath she had learned for difficult moments. In and hold and out and hold, a steadiness that made numbers less sharp. Then she woke the cursor and typed the word with care, each letter set down like a footprint that promised to stay. Digitalis. The results arrived like a quiet hallway with many doors. She chose the doors that looked most plain. The first page spoke in leaflet voice, tidy and exact, and it said foxglove, the flower from picture books, with tall bell towers of purple and white, a prettiness that would not apologize for ringing. It said medicine when given with measure, danger when given without, and it laid out what a heart understands and what it can forget. It told of beats that wander, of rhythm that miscounts, of a pulse that pauses to think and then forgets to begin again. It told of hands that tremble, of stomachs that refuse kindness, of halos around lamps, of color loosening at the edges. It told how a thing can build in the body until the body hears wrong. The hospital returned to her behind her eyes, the beige light, the slow chorus of machines pretending to be calm. She saw her mother's skin with its shine taken off, and the tired kindness of a smile that still had instructions in it. Tell the truth. Even when Rachel scrolled, the page explained doses and ranges, teaspoons and tablets, clocks and warnings, the ways a careful hand can help a failing heart, and the ways an uncareful hand can turn an ordinary evening into a quiet emergency. It listed early signs and later signs, and the ones only a watcher notices at 3 in the morning when the room is busy being still. She read until the words made pictures the kitchen could hold: a pot, a ladle, a small brown bottle whose cap clicks once, steam that smells right, and then a sweetness that does not belong in soup, not sugar, not spice, something with a glassy edge. A bowl lifted and carried down a hallway, the porcelain tapping the tray like a polite knock that asks to be let in double. She went to the kitchen in socks, so the floor would not remember her steps. The apartment breathed its night breath. The purse sat by the backsplash wearing patience. On the counter, in a faint dusting of flour, Her crescent notch still held its place. A tiny white moon she had bitten into the day before. The microwave glowed its green numbers, steady as soldiers. She looked away so she would not turn seconds into teeth. She lifted an empty bowl and set it down again to hear the knock of clay on wood, and the sound said ordinary. She stood very still and listened for the echo she had learned by heart at the hospital. The long, unbroken tone that turns the world into frost. Of course it was not here. Echoes stay with their rooms. Back at the desk, she drew the journal closer, reread the entry where her mother had written what she feared, and then questioned herself for fearing it. The words accused no one. They simply noticed, and then confessed the noticing, and then tucked the guilt around it like a blanket. That was how her mother wrote. A lantern holder who knew where to point the beam and when to lower it. She set the journal down and slid the old phone's clear sleeve beneath the lamp, so the photo's small text would sharpen. The image she had taken in the kitchen glowed without shouting. She read the label again, the medicine name, the strength, and then the lot letters and numbers that turned bottles into citizens. She said them in her head the way Aunt Margaret had said them earlier. Each marked like a rung on a ladder. She typed that line into the search field, not as a guess now but as a door code, and pressed the return key. A registrar appeared, one of those lists that exist because someone in a clean room wants the world to be findable. She followed a link that had no decoration, and there the batch sat in a simple row, matched to a month and a facility with a stamped date. She practiced reading the dates the way the page wanted them read. She did not feel small while she did it. Numbers were not grown up or child. They were only true or something else. She pulled open the desk drawer, and the wood gave its soft scrape, the sound of a promise that shuts all the way. Inside, the manila sleeve Aunt Margaret had left carried a photocopy of the courier receipt, still slightly warm in Rachel's mind, from the auntly hand that had pressed it there. She placed the receipt beside the registrar line, and touched each date with a fingertip, then bridged them with her finger as if joining islands with a causeway. She did not say any of this out loud. The lamp already understood. The beige house phone sat to the right like an old friend who still knows your first home number. She lifted the receiver and dialed the special digits Margaret had spoken into her palm that afternoon, the for any hour digits, the when the air thins digits. "I am here," said Aunt Margaret before the second ring finished. "Speak." "I read," Rachel said, and her voice did not wobble. The leaflet voice, the part about halos and wrong rhythm, the building up inside a person. I looked up the lot. The letters match. The month matches. The stamp sits in the square where it belongs. Say the line. Margaret said, not testing, just letting the girl hear herself in the world. Rachel spoke the code slowly. Letters like quiet stones. Numbers like steps between them. The small dash like a bridge. Margaret repeated it back. One measured footfall after another, and said, "Good. Keep the copy. I have twins of those pages here. In a room with robes and recorders, a finger will be able to walk from this to that without stumbling." Rachel looked at the journal again and felt the dull ache that sits beneath courage. Do words written by a person who is gone weigh the same as words spoken by a person who is here? She wanted to ask, and found that she already knew. The weight is different only in where the body feels it. Is there any part that can be wrong? She asked instead, because some small piece of fear still paced in the corner. There are always parts that try to be wrong, Margaret said, voice like a hand over a shaking cup. Feelings change shape, memories blur at the edges. But bottles keep their labels, no matter who is kind. Cameras keep their hours, no matter who is charming. Blood remembers what passed through it. We are asking the right questions in the right order. A plan is only that. Rachel nodded into the lamp's circle. The fan in the laptop gave a patient sigh. The line held a soft quiet that was not empty. "Sleep if you can," Margaret said at last. "Morning has its own weight. I want your shoulders ready." "Not yet," Rachel answered. "There is a small thing, I can almost see it. When I look directly at it, it hides. Let it stand where it was made," said Margaret. "Close your eyes. Walk back through the door you ignored because a louder door was shouting." The small things, like the quiet doorways, they stayed on the line and allowed the apartment to make its simple noises. Outside, a car's light scaled the far wall and slid away. Rachel breathed the square breath and went back. Kitchen night. Pot breathing. Cap clicking once and only once. Ladle scraping enamel. The sound that makes her teeth think of thin ice. A bowl lifted. Steam stitching itself to the air. Down the hall. The slow knock of porcelain on tray. Her mother's mouth. The spoon, the almost smile that still passed along instructions. In the tray's corner, a cloth napkin, not paper, white with a narrow blue line. There, the small thing stepped forward, shy and sure. The blue border had not been an even sky that night. A pale bloom had opened beside it. Not soup, not broth, a ring that glass bottoms leave when they climb out of cold into warm. The bottle had rested on the napkin's corner for a breath too long before the bowl replaced it. That is why the mark had appeared. It was the kind of truth that does not speak until you invite it. "Margaret," Rachel said, and the aunt's breath answered before the name finished. "The napkin," Rachel said. The blue line had a faint, wet ghost on it. From the bottle's side, she stood there longer than a helper stands. "I did not know it mattered when I saw it." "It matters." On the line came that soft yes built of breath alone. "Keep that," Margaret said. "Fold it and put it in your pocket. Sometimes the moment when a pretender forgets she is pretending is just a ring on cotton." Rachel opened her eyes and could see the ring again as clearly as a remembered bell. It was not proof by itself. It was a witness that lends weight to other voices. She felt taller by a fraction, not because she had grown, but because the floor had stopped pretending to tilt. "Thank you," she said. "Sleep," Margaret said, and set the receiver gently back wherever night keeps necessary things. Rachel cradled the phone and returned it to its rest. She smoothed the journal page with 2 fingers, not to press the ache out, but to promise the ache a place to sit. She turned the laptop a little, so the fan could breathe like a calm animal. She slid the notebook into the drawer and let the wood scrape sign its name. She left the photo under the lamp as if the warm light could teach the ink to stay bold. On her way to bed, she paused in the kitchen. The purse had not moved. Her crescent notch still brightened the counter's dust. She took a clean cloth napkin from the drawer, the kind with the blue border, and laid it where the light could admire it. She filled a glass with cold water and set it on the corner. When she lifted the glass, a ring stayed. A simple circle insisting that a moment had happened. She folded the napkin and carried it to her room. Not because it was the same, but because lessons stay better when you can touch them. Under the covers, the locket cool, then remembered her heat. Her eyes closed and rose once more to be sure the room was the room. She pictured the memorial table, white cloth, framed photograph, candles with small steady lung. She pictured the row of clear water glasses waiting to be tapped into speech. She pictured the napkin in her mother's room, the blue border, with its faint ghost ring. Tomorrow and tomorrow's tomorrow would ask for steady hands. She felt her hands become steadier. Sleep arrived like a kind teacher who knows when to leave a student alone with a problem she can now solve. The apartment let its shoulders drop. The notebook held its folded lesson. The drawer kept its signature. The small quiet ring kept its light, ready to rise in her mind. When the room finally called for the truth, morning unfolded with the kind of care that people reserve for fragile things. The air above the church hall was pale, almost see-through, and the light from the tall windows bent itself politely across the rows of folding chairs. Rachel stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped behind her back, watching as the room learned how to hold its breath. The smell of lilies lingered, clean and cold, edged with candle wax and polished metal. Somewhere outside, a car door closed softly, the sound arriving, like punctuation to a sentence no one wanted to finish. Aunt Margaret's hand rested for a heartbeat against the small of Rachel's back, the kind of touch that reminded her she wasn't alone, then fell away so the girl could stand on her own. The locket at Rachel's throat had grown warm against her skin, the ribbon pinned just beneath it, catching the faintest blue from the morning light. She moved forward slowly, letting her eyes gather the room one detail at a time. The white cloth draped over the memorial table, her mother's photograph in a silver frame, the neat rows of chairs that looked too expectant for what was coming. Pastor Mike crossed from one side to the other, checking the wicks in the candles, his lighter making soft, whispering clicks. Behind him, volunteers arranged trays of glasses, the delicate ring of glass on glass, marking the rhythm of preparation. Aunt Margaret took a seat at the end of the second row and began to open a small folder, her movements calm, deliberate, almost ceremonial. In her jacket pocket, the outline of her phone pressed against the fabric like a promise waiting to be spoken. Gideon entered quietly from the vestibule, carrying a garment bag slung over his shoulder, his suit jacket already creased from too many mornings like this one. His smile, when he found Rachel, looked worn but determined, the kind of smile that worked hard to stay upright. He placed both hands on her shoulders, his thumbs rubbing small circles near her collarbones. "You all right, princess?" he asked, voice low, rough from too many unslept nights. Rachel nodded once, a small, contained motion. If she spoke, the truth might come out too early, and timing mattered now. Her father looked relieved at the gesture, mistaking composure for peace. He gave her shoulders a squeeze that lingered too long and whispered, "Your mom would be proud of you." Then he turned away before she could see his eyes fold in on themselves. The elevator at the far end of the hallway dinged softly. Through the open doors stepped Miss Glattis, her heels measuring the floor like a ruler. She wore black, of course, an impeccable kind, the sort that swallowed light instead of reflecting it. A folded white tissue already sat in her hand, ready before there was reason to use it. Her perfume arrived first, faintly medicinal, the kind that lived halfway between flowers and bleach. Gideon moved toward her as if pulled by a magnet made of memory and gratitude. Rachel stood still and watched. She had learned to see in small frames the way Gladys's eyes swept across the hall, cataloging chairs, faces, exits, the way her fingertips traced the memorial table's edge, as if confirming its weight. Every gesture meant something. Everything was inventory. Glattis's smile, when it reached Gideon, was perfect, practiced, symmetrical. It was a kindness that demanded witness. Aunt Margaret came to stand beside Rachel, holding a thin white ribbon. Its edge carried a single blue line. She pinned it to Rachel's dress just below the locket. The color made Rachel think of that cloth napkin, of the faint ring pressed into it by a sweating bottle. Margaret leaned in, her voice barely a breath. "The lab has the run on the bench now," she murmured. "They know our clock. We will have what we need when we need it." Rachel didn't look up. She simply nodded, her hand closing over the ribbon, tracing the seam where blue met white. The words settled in her chest like a stone that finally found its place on the riverbed. The room began to fill, slowly, politely, like a tide that respected furniture. Neighbors arrived with folded programs and quiet footsteps. Someone carried cookies wrapped in crinkling plastic, and the sound made the air feel suddenly human. Rachel felt each sound separately, the shuffle of coats, the small coughs people make to prove they're still alive, the whisper of paper sliding against paper as programs changed hands. Every sound marked a step closer to what was waiting. At the far side of the hall, Mr. Robert stood by the side door, testing the push bar with one practiced hand. The door gave a small metallic sigh but stayed obedient. He nodded once, a man confirming that exits would do as they were told. A few rows up, the tall man in the blue tie, the one Margaret had pointed out that morning, took his seat near the aisle, his back straight, his gaze unhurried. He looked at the stage, at the door, at nothing and everything at once. Pastor Mike approached the podium and cleared his throat. His microphone gave a low hum before he decided he didn't need it. The candles flickered, their flames settling into quiet patience. Gideon returned to Rachel's side, his tie slightly crooked, his eyes glassy in a way that didn't belong to tears yet. He bent toward her again. "You sit with Aunt Margaret," he said. "If you need to step out, you can. Miss Glattis will speak at the end. We'll go home after, maybe order pizza. Just us." Rachel gave a small nod, her face unreadable. The mention of Glattis's name landed inside her like a cold coin. Her father straightened his tie, smiled weakly, and moved toward the front row, where Glattis waited, with her tissue already folded into thirds. A soft prelude from the small choir began. A piano, a single violin, the sound slow and cautious, as if afraid to fill the space too quickly. People took their seats, the candles stretched their flames upward. Listening, Pastor Mike spoke a few words about grace, about memory, about how a life could ripple through other lives. Rachel listened without moving, counting the seconds between sentences, her pulse syncing with the rhythm of his pauses. When the stories began, the air grew warmer. Neighbors stood and spoke about laughter, about recipes, about small kindnesses that did not seem small anymore. Each voice built a piece of her mother again, the way threads make a fabric. Rachel listened and let her mind trace each word against the truth she already knew, that every act of kindness her mother gave had been repaid with a spoonful of sweetness that killed her slowly. The stories ended. Pastor Mike thanked them. The silence that followed had a weight, the kind that bends the floorboards. Then, from the first row, Miss Glattis rose. She stood gracefully, smoothing her dress with one hand, the other still holding that immaculate tissue. The room seemed to turn its attention toward her as if drawn by gravity. She took a step toward the podium. Every movement was practiced, every breath rehearsed. Aunt Margaret, still seated, did not look away from the stage. She leaned the smallest fraction toward Rachel and whispered, "Blue tie, third row left." Rachel's eyes found him, the tall man, still, steady, the only one in the room who did not blink when Glattis moved. His focus was clean, professional, unthreatening. Rachel knew without being told. He was here for what came next. Gideon turned toward Rachel once more, perhaps seeking reassurance, perhaps trying to give it. "Be kind today," he whispered, the words trembling like something fragile handed over in haste. Rachel didn't answer. The locket pulsed warm against her skin, the ribbon steady beneath her fingers. Miss Glattis reached the microphone. She paused, allowing the room's silence to gather, letting it polish her voice before she used it. The tissue brushed her cheek, a gesture made for the crowd. Pastor Mike stepped back, head bowed, offering the stage. The candles trembled in a draft that wasn't really there. Somewhere behind Rachel, a chair creaked, and then stilled. Margaret's phone, deep in her pocket, vibrated once, a soft, wordless hum that stopped as soon as it began. Rachel didn't turn. She didn't need to. The sound had already written itself into her bones. The lab had finished. Miss Glattis inhaled. Slow, deliberate, about to begin the sentence that would dress her guilt in grief. Rachel exhaled. The ribbon at her chest fluttered once, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Aunt Margaret's fingers brushed the edge of her pocket, pressing the phone flat. The second hand on the clock above the door completed its circle and began another. Everything was ready. The hall waited. The air, the chairs, the people, the truth itself, holding perfectly still, the way a pond holds the reflection of a cloud just before the stone breaks the surface. The room had folded itself around the silence that Miss Glattis carried to the podium. She touched the microphone lightly, testing its patience. Her voice rose soft and rehearsed, words smooth as the flowers behind her. The first line was about kindness, the next about loss, and the third was about a friendship that had never existed. Rachel stood. Chairs creaked in surprise. The noise of metal against tile was small, but it made every head turn. She felt her heartbeat thudding through the thin blue line of ribbon on her chest. Her voice came from somewhere steady, somewhere older than 9. "You are lying," she said. "You are not her friend. You killed my mom." The words crossed the hall like a stone through water. A glass fell from someone's hand and shattered, a bright sound that froze the air. Pastor Mike lifted one hand, half reaching for calm that would not come. Gideon rose too, his face pale, his mouth opening on the name he still called her, Princess. But Rachel didn't look at him. She looked only at Glattis. The woman's expression flickered, the pity folding in on itself, then straightening into a smile that showed too many teeth. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "I know you're hurt. We're all hurt. Sit down now. You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do." Rachel lifted the clear plastic sleeve so light cut through it. Inside, the photograph glowed. Brown bottle, white label, the words Digitalis, written in clean black ink, Lot D-17-A2. "I took this picture in our kitchen. You poured it into the soup." The microwave clock said 21:14. Voices swelled, half questions, half disbelief. Pastor Mike froze mid-step. Gideon stared at the photo as if it were written in a language he almost understood. Aunt Margaret rose, slow and certain, and moved beside Rachel. "We sent a sample to an independent lab," Margaret said, her voice calm as a gavel. "They confirmed Digitalis. The report came just now." She lifted her phone slightly, eyes skimming the message. "Concentrations consistent with repeated dosing." She read aloud. "This was no accident, no error. It was planned." The crowd murmured again, a ripple that reached every wall. Mr. Roberts stepped closer to the side door, his broad frame a quiet barrier. In the third row, the man with the blue tie stood, Detective Morrison, and moved forward, his steps unhurried, his voice soft enough to let people breathe. "Ma'am," he said to Glattis, "my name is Detective Morrison. I'll need you to come with me. We can do this quietly." Glattis blinked, her gaze sliding between faces, searching for the old arrangement of power she had once enjoyed. "Gideon," she said quickly, eyes shining with feigned confusion, "you can't believe this. It's grief talking. The poor child doesn't understand. She's twisting things. I was trying to help you. To protect you." Protect, Rachel thought, and felt her hands tighten. Protect meant control. Protect meant poison. The tissue in Glattis's hand shredded slowly between her fingers. Her smile trembled at its edges. "You don't know what you're doing," she said, her voice thinner now. "You'll regret this. You're just a little girl who needs someone to take care of her." Rachel stepped forward, her small shoes whispering against the floor. "You already tried," she said. "You made soup. You smiled at my dad. You wore my mom's sweater. You said it would not be much longer. I heard you. You told someone on the phone." Glattis's mouth opened. But no words came. The room waited, the crowd's breath a single tide. Gideon moved then, his face hollow. "Tell me," he said, his voice breaking on the space between words. "Tell me you didn't hurt Grace. Look at me. Tell me." For the first time, Miss Glattis looked afraid, not of the law, but of being seen. Her lips shaped a denial, but her voice betrayed her. It was supposed to be gentle, she whispered. She never had to feel it. The confession landed like dust on water, spreading in rings that touched everyone. Pastor Mike closed his eyes. A woman near the back began to sob quietly. The detective stepped forward, drawing a small pair of handcuffs from his coat pocket. "Ma'am," he said, "you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent." Glattis turned toward the side door, a final grasp at escape. But Mr. Roberts moved into her path. She collided with him and staggered, her heel catching the edge of the rug. The cuffs clicked, a crisp metallic syllable that ended the long sentence of her lies. Aunt Margaret handed the photograph and the journal page to Detective Morrison. He slipped them into a larger evidence pouch, sealed it with a strip of numbered tape, and wrote the time on the label. "Chain of custody," he murmured, more to himself than anyone. Not a story, a bridge. Gideon had dropped to his knees beside the front row. Rachel walked to him, her steps quiet. He reached for her hands, rough palms trembling. "I should have listened," he said, the words breaking apart. "I should have seen you. I made you stand alone." Rachel shook her head. Her throat ached with too many answers. Behind them, Aunt Margaret stood still, her presence a quiet wall against the noise of the world. Detective Morrison guided Glattis down the aisle. She kept her head high, but her shoulders had learned the truth's weight. People stepped back to let her pass. Some turned away. Others did not. At the door, the light caught her face one last time, bleaching it into something hollow. The door opened with a soft sigh, then closed behind her. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence that comes after thunder, when people are not yet sure if the storm is truly gone. Aunt Margaret's phone vibrated again. She glanced down, reading the message, before slipping it away. "The lab's official certificate just arrived," she said quietly. "It confirms everything." Pastor Mike moved toward them, his hands trembling as he reached for Gideon's shoulder. "Let's take a moment," he said softly. His voice carried no sermon now, only human weight. He lit one of the candles again, steadying the wick with his fingers. The flame caught and stayed. One by one, people began to leave. They spoke in whispers, in fragments. "Thank you. I'm so sorry. God bless you." Rachel barely heard them. She was watching the candlelight flicker against the photo of her mother. The light seemed to breathe with her. Mr. Roberts swept the broken glass into a dustpan, the shards chiming like small bells. He moved carefully, not to waste the sound. When he was done, he nodded to Rachel as if she had done something sacred. Gideon stood slowly. His face looked older now, stripped of all the pretending that had protected him. He placed one hand on Rachel's shoulder and one on Margaret's. "We're going home," he said. The words were heavy but right. At the memorial table, Rachel paused. She touched the ribbon at her chest, the small blue line bright under the candlelight. The locket at her throat was warm again, steady as a heartbeat. She reached out and straightened the photograph's frame. Her mother's eyes in the picture seemed calm, almost knowing. Aunt Margaret joined her, setting down the folded journal beside the flowers. "Truth leaves a mark," she said quietly. "Sometimes that is the mercy." Outside, the sun was still waiting, pale but certain. The air smelled of rain far away. Rachel stepped into it, her father on one side, her aunt on the other. Behind them, the church door clicked shut, soft as a closing book. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Gideon whispered, "Thank you, sweetheart, for being brave." Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth had already said everything. The light found them as they walked, thin gold through gray clouds, a promise that felt less like peace and more like continuation. Somewhere inside, the candles kept burning. The lilies exhaled their clean scent. The stone had been thrown. The water was still rippling, clear now, and wide. At its heart, Rachel versus Glattis is not only a story about justice, it's a story about courage in the quietest places. It reminds us that truth often lives in the hands of those least expected to carry it, and that silence, though comfortable, can sometimes become its own kind of harm. Rachel's bravery isn't loud or perfect. It's the steady kind that comes from love, loss, and the refusal to let a lie shape her mother's memory. In her, we see how strength can look like standing still when everyone else wants you to sit down. For adults who have lived long enough to know that goodness can be complicated, this story whispers a deeper lesson, that real integrity is not about being unbreakable, but about being willing to face what breaks you and still choosing what's right. The world will always have its Glattises, people who disguise control as care, who thrive in others' silence. But as the old saying goes, truth may walk slowly, but it always arrives. Justice isn't about revenge, it's about reclaiming peace, dignity, and the freedom to breathe again. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a moment of standing up when it wasn't easy, share your thoughts below. Have you ever faced a truth that demanded courage? Leave a comment. Hit the like button if Rachel's voice resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories that explore the gray edges of humanity and the light that breaks through them. May you find peace in your own truths, strength in your quiet moments, and the kind of hope that, even after chaos, feels like sunrise.